All right, I think we can get started. Once again, good morning. My name is Rolando Scott. We'll get to introductions in a second, but thank you for joining us on this session on what we called Playing the Odds with the DC Lottery website rebuild. We want to tell our story of how the rebuild worked, all the work that had to be put into it and all, the wins and the things that we learned along the way. So it's very interesting. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. So, like I said, my name is Rolando Scott. I'm the director of Drupal development at Teoti. Teoti is a creative agency in Washington D.C. We work mostly with Drupal sites, but we also do WordPress and a bunch of other sites. I oversee about 30 developers in our department, and I'm involved in anything Drupal at the agency. Brittany?
And my name is Brittany Bailey. I'm a senior project manager here at Teoti. I had the pleasure of working with Rolando on this redesign and continue to with the client to get to annoy Rolando for however long we continue to keep them on for maintenance now as well.
Cool. And as you can see, when we're not building sites or servicing clients, I'm actually a volunteer firefighter, and Brittany is a diver. She likes to go head first into the ocean. I personally prefer run into fires than go into the ocean, but I think fires are less scary. Cool. So let's get started. Let's talk about the project a little bit.
Yeah, so as a lot of y'all here might be familiar with, this was a government-based agency. It's a little bit interesting because it is a lottery, so that means it is a for-profit agency as well, but it is a part of the government. They are monitored by the government, everything like that. So it was a contract, and it was to redesign their information-based website. As y'all are also probably familiar with, it was a very tight timeline. Aren't they always, though, right? And there's also some really specific needs that they had that we'll go into a little bit more detail later. And then another fun aspect was just there were so many stakeholders and point of contacts that we had. It's of course a really great client, really easy to work with. We love them, and so it was a fun one. But let's talk a little bit about their goals. Actually, sorry, Rolando will first talk about their old site, which I like to forget about.
Yeah, one of the first challenges as soon as we got this project was working with their current site, right? The site they had, right? It was a custom built CMS that another agency built just for them. And imagine grabbing a client requirements and building a site that works exactly as is for what the client requirements were when it was built. But obviously, as everybody understands, client requirements change over time, and unfortunately, the way this CMS was built, it couldn't adapt. So it was really hard. It was really hard for DC Lottery to make updates on the system and content. They did have a dev environment, but it wasn't connected in any way to the live environment. It was just like an old copy of the site. So you couldn't really guarantee that any changes that you did on the dev environment would make it okay to the live environment. And it had a bunch of custom functionality that was hard coded in. So there were pages where the client just could not change the content or the images or anything. And it was so, square and non-modular that when DC Lottery actually needed a new functionality, it was easier for them to create a second website to add that new functionality than to expand on this one. So part of the requirements, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, was not only building a new site, but joining these two sites in one. Um, um, let's talk about the content a little bit.
Yeah, and I can jump in a little bit here. So the content, of course, was a really, really huge aspect about this project. They had over 3.5 million drawing numbers, all in different formats that we did need to migrate over. Of course, they continue to now increase since then. But that was, a very big import. All had to be done very uniquely. So every single game had to be imported, specifically for those formats. We also imported and migrated over 10,000 active users. And with those active users came 650 records of contest entries. So as you can tell, this database is just growing and growing already. So we had a big database to start with. And then of course the actual like content for how they set up the games and talking about who they are as a lottery and what they do with the community. We had 150 nodes of manually migrated content. Rolando just told you a little bit about the previous CMS. It was not able to allow us to do an export of content, and we did provide the client with more paragraph types and unique ways to be able to add content pretty easily. And so we had to do that manually. So then now, since I wanted to jump to the project goals so quickly before, I'll actually go over some of those. Some of the biggest ones were to increase engagement of users and players, to make some of their different content and products a priority, so like bringing that back to the forefront. And of course, making that backend editing experience easier for their administrators. And part of that, of course, is using Drupal. They really did want to go with an open source platform, and Drupal was an obvious choice for this one. They wanted to improve the design, also make it responsive. We wanted to combine both of the sites that Rolando had mentioned into one. It did still need to be a 508 compliant site as it is a government agency. And of course, mentioning before that tight timeline, we still needed to finish before their end of the fiscal year.
Talking a little bit about the approach that we took, like Brittany said, there was a no-brainer. Drupal is exactly what they needed. We did a redesign with modern takes and had to be very flexible with paragraphs and the content builder. We're able to create certain components that are reusable, right? That could be added to different pages to make the pages look different while reusing some of the styles and some of the components. Making mobile a priority was a no-brainer as well. Their site wasn't really responsive. Now it is. We did a mobile first design. Since most of their users, our research showed that most of their users do look at the site on their phones. A lot of times they're just looking to see if the numbers came in, if they're a millionaire now or not, quickly on their phone. So it had to load quickly, it had to load well on their phone. We customized the backend, the admin theme, and the workflows of Drupal to very tailored to the IT department and the rest of the editors for the DC Lottery client. They really wanted to be able to do things in a certain way, and we were able to cater to that, right? And the other thing we talked about was combining both of those sites into one site, which was yeah, easy enough using Drupal. And the last thing we wanted to make sure was that there were no hard coded pages, because that was a big pain point for them. We wanted to make sure every page could be customized and edited by their team, so they wouldn't have to have an external developer come in to change absolutely anything on the site. So that was the initial approach that we thought about. Let's talk a little bit about the process to get there.
Yeah, so like most agencies probably across this field and working with Drupal and WordPress, we like to take initial start with going over through the discovery. With this client, of course, as I mentioned, there was a lot of stakeholders that were involved in the project as a whole. But for the discovery, there was actually 5 different groups of 15 to 20 stakeholder interviews. So there was a lot of opinions, a lot of discussions that got brought forth. And we had to digest kind of all of that, put it into something that would make sense, something that allowed the users to really easily find the games that they were wanting to play, really easily find more information and related products. So the information architecture, that menu was a really important step. We spent just a few weeks making sure that we had all of the priorities from all of the different departments be involved. Of course, we then went into user experience design and wireframes, making sure we had the priority content where it needed to be. So for example, a lot of users, they want to, when they first go to see their winning numbers. So we needed to make sure to prioritize that type of content. Of course, once we kind of laid out all of the prioritization of the menu and the content on those pages with the wireframes, we then went into the visual design. That was a really, really fun part of working with this client is we really had a lot of flexibility and fun with those designs. We got to do a lot of color. It is involved in playing games. And so we got to be really playful and colorful, which is really exciting. And of course, we had to include a lot of different responsive breakpoints because we wanted to make sure that no matter where the user was coming from, if it was from their mobile, a tablet, a small desktop, a larger computer, that we had all elements covered. And then, we pass over to Rolando's team in development. And what he didn't mention earlier when he was talking about those different fields and some of the other elements of making it usable and really easy for the client, he also had to deal with me being very specific in how I like to use Drupal as a project manager and making sure that I had all of the different fields and tabs, everything in an organization that not only made sense to the client, but that also made sense to me as their project manager and the person who trained the client to use it. So the development team not only had to listen to the client's needs, but also mine, which was always fun. And then we passed it on to our internal QA team. They did a full quality assurance review of the site, make sure that at all of those different breakpoints, everything was still working, everything was still clickable. And then we passed over to client review and their testing. I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later, but that was a fun part. And then, of course, the party was at 4 a.m. on launch day. Yes, that was 4 a.m. We were all awake. And, as the majority of y'all probably have experienced to do a launch in the middle of the night, that's just when it needs to be done.
I'm actually gonna talk a little bit about that. One of the complexities of this site is that it gets updated every 5 minutes with new drawings from some of their electronic games. So if you think about that, that's quite a challenge. You have a site that is dynamically updated every 5 minutes. That brings a lot of complexities. For example, oh, and apart from that, you have users logging in, entering codes, being parts of promotions. So the site is changing all the time, which means we have to be, we're always careful with sites that are in production. But there are certain sites there, if there is an error, if there's something wrong, you can just kind of back them up from, restore them from a backup. This is not an option, DC Lottery. With this site, if there is an error, if there is a mistake, even if we have a backup from 20 minutes ago, it's already missing a ton of information just because it's missing the drawing numbers and the promotions and the users and everything else. So we have to be extra careful when working with this site. And the reason the launch was at 4 a.m. is because these electronic drawings that get updated every 5 minutes happen from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. Every single day of the week. So there's just this 4-hour window where the site wasn't being updated, where we could launch and not make sure we didn't lose information. So yeah, launch was pretty. It was something. It was definitely something.
Yeah, and so with that, of course, there's complications. I promise I'll explain the image that I've included here. But first, as I talked a little bit before, there were the large groups of stakeholders. After those stakeholder interviews, there was a committee of 15. So there's 15 core stakeholders involved in every single decision. So when we reviewed the IA, when we reviewed the designs, the wires, all of those elements, there were 15 core stakeholders providing opinions. There was also multiple vendors to work with and manage. As you can imagine, that's a fun job. There was several different API integrations, all needing special attention and sometimes all needing different developers. Some developers would work on this API integration while another developer was working on another one. And then part of Rolando's favorite is undocumented features from the old site. That was a fun thing to discover along the way. And then when we were in that user acceptance testing with the client, when they were doing their review, their testing, the contacts are not as technical savvy. And so it just was a really interesting and complicated process trying to make sure that if they could understand the site, a user could understand it, which is really good, but also just kind of being really clear about what they needed to test. Really clear instructions, go to this page, do this test. And so it just caused a little bit more time and complications in that sense. And then, this since with this being a government agency, it was a contract, and so there were requirements to fulfill from the contract. For example, there was pages, and if there it was brand new pages, we needed to create that content. So the client actually was able to provide us with bullet points, and then we were able to create content from those bullet points to allow the user to help achieve some of those goals. The reason that we've got zebras here is because, as you can imagine, working with a lot of stakeholders, a lot of vendors, a lot of developers, I feel like sometimes my job is a little bit of herding wild migrating zebras. It's fun, of course. It's just one of those things to manage and continue with. So complications always are part of a project. And each time I do a new project, we learn from it and are able to, improve the next time as well.
Course, it's super important. And out of all these unforeseen complications, at least the one that was the biggest thorn in my side was definitely the undocumented features from the old site.
Wait,
As
not me?
apart from you, Brittany, apart from you, well, it's always hard, or it's always a challenge to work on anybody else's code, right? To gather information from it. But when you're using a proprietary CMS that was built just for this client that didn't have great documentation, boy, was that hard. Like we were learning things while we were building the site. I remember having tons of conversations with Brittany about like, hey, this part here, do you have any idea where this is coming from, or where, the source of this? And her answer a lot of times was no, we didn't. So we kind of had to do a lot of investigating work. The developers that worked with me on this project were amazing because a lot of times they just had to dive into the code and figure things out. So part of working with the site and doing a migration like this is part of that, is doing detective work and not waiting for the client to tell you everything, because there's a good chance not even the client knows, right? So yeah, that was definitely one of the biggest complications. While we were kind of done with the site and launched, obviously DC Lottery wanted additional things. They wanted to add different things to the site. So I want to talk a little bit about the additional features that we added. One of the first things that we did was add a virtual events. DC Lottery does a lot, well, before the pandemic, did a lot of in-person events. They would go to places, they would host parties, they would get a DJ in and give a ton of giveaways and do stuff like that. Translating that into the virtual world obviously was a little bit complex. We are doing it right now. Instead of this being an in-person session, we're doing it online. But they wanted something custom made, so we did it in a way where they could host, celebrities. And the first case, they used the NBA player Robin Lopez. They interviewed him. They had a chat going on. They had promotions. They had giveaways, all virtually, and it worked out pretty well. With the same tool, they've been able to do some private events as well, and then a bunch of other public events. So that was a good thing, and it's something that we're seeing that a lot of clients need in this day and age, right? Um, Another thing we created for them, which I think was really cool and they really liked, was an interactive map, right? Where do you go to buy a lottery ticket while you're in Washington D.C.? And what tickets are available? Because there's a bunch of games. Some of them are electronic. Some of them you have to actually buy a little ticket. Some of them are daily. Some of them are weekly. There's a bunch of combinations. So with this map, it can literally tell you what the name of the store, what type of games that they sell, and this is real time information. One of the cool things that I always like from a UX perspective is we don't, I'm sure you guys have seen that a bunch of sites, as soon as you load into the site, it asks you to share your location. I personally dislike that a lot because maybe I don't want to, or maybe I don't understand why I the page hasn't even finished loading. So one of the choices we made with this is having that option available as an option. If you click on the little icon and the enter your address, it'll ask you like, hey, do you want to share your location? And it'll tell you exactly which place is closest from a walking distance. You can say a mile, you can say 5 miles, and it'll tell you exactly where you should go to buy the lottery ticket. So that I think that was pretty cool. They seemed to like it a lot. One of the issues that DC Lottery had before is that the when you could subscribe to get the winning numbers to your inbox, but the way it was built before, it was hard coded that at a certain hour that email would go out, right? And most of the times the numbers would be there and posted on the website, so that email would go out just fine. But there are some times where there are different things happen where the drawings actually occur a little bit later. And what happened is, since that email was programmed to go out at, let's say, 6 in the evening, that email would go out blank because it didn't have the numbers yet because the numbers hadn't been posted. So it seems like a very easy thing to fix, and we did. We basically made a trigger where once the numbers are posted, then the email goes out to make sure emails don't go out empty. It's a simple problem with a simple solution, but it makes a huge impact because no one wants to receive an empty email and say, hey, what's going on. We also integrated MailChimp and SMS text for notifications, for drawing numbers, and a bunch of other things. They have a lot of content, so we created related content based on what the user was seeing and what they usually look for. So if you're looking at one type of game, we're gonna show you other types of games that you might want to see, or other types of news that we might think is important for you. All that is super important to get all that information that's on the website catered to you as the user. The last thing we worked on is, as more people use the site, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, the more amount of drawings and numbers and codes that we gather, exporting that data that they use to be able to select winners from drawings, right, became a burden. Like, we started at, I don't know, 15,000 entries per month. Till, depending on the game and the promotion, we're talking about 100,000 entries per month. And exporting 100,000 entries with the user's name, their address, their phone, and a bunch of other information, is taxing. It's taxing on the database. It's taxing on the system. So we had to come up with creative ways, making sure we did that in batches, and make sure, it has a very specific format because it's actually legally binding. There's a bunch of things related to those exports. So as the site grew, we kind of had to grow with it and go through some growing pains and adapt. But it's all part of the process. I think the main lesson here is that even though you can build a site and work on with the site, and have it be perfect, the site is always changing, and the content is always changing, and there's more users, and there's different things, and requirements change. So you, as the agency that are creating a site, even for a government site that has like the bias of being a little bit more slow to react, you should be able to adapt to those new requirements and those new changes. I always tell this story when building this site, that when we were doing the dashboard, there's the functionality where you can log in, you can create a profile, and you can add some codes to your user, right? And then you're entered in drawings, and you can win some prizes and stuff. When I was doing the dashboard, I created a query, right, a view of your tickets, and I just showed all of them, right? I just assumed that was okay. While we were testing, I was seeing the site timing out, and I was like, weird. Why would the site time out, right? It turns out that we discovered that there are, I kind of assumed people would have like 25, 30 codes or whatever. There are people that have 5,000 codes in their profile, right? I had no idea there are people that played this so much. So obviously, when you have a query that gives so many results back, you have to put in a pager because nobody wants to see 5,000 results at once. So those were the one of the lessons that we learned along the way. As the site grew, we needed to make sure the information that we were giving people was catered to them and the amount of results and the amount of content on the site. So let's talk a little bit more about results, actually.
Yeah, so that's another exciting part, of course, of any project, right? You want to be able to show what you improved, what you achieved. Did you achieve the goals? And with one of the goals being increase of engagement, we actually got over 130 subscribed players. So that's over half than what we currently had when we migrated over that 10,000. So that's really awesome. And there's also now over 1.5 million contest entries. So I mentioned earlier we had 6.5 that we migrated over. I think that was about a 10-year span or so. So just in 1 year, we did 1.5 million, which I think both of these things go to show about how we did make the experience easier for the user. So all of that work that we did during discovery and UX and designs really paid off because it's really clear that users are able to go in, create accounts, and participate in the different contests really easily. Of course, that goes with improving analytics. Just the users on the site improved. The number of people that come back to the site has increased. There's also been improved engagement, like I mentioned, with those players, not only with those, but also just different people contacting in, everything like that has gone up. And then, of course, a result that I don't want to not mention is that the editors can now easily edit their content. That was one of our huge goals. Make this easier for the client. So now the client does have that capability of going in and making those changes to pages, creating new pages, new promotions really easily. So in the end, it really did turn out well.
Just to recap a little bit of the things we learned, there are limitations in how we treat all data, right? The past, and we're talking about millions of drawings, right? Millions of drawing numbers. They used to save the data with just the numbers, like 70, 36, 24, 24, 40, and 22, the multiplier, right? What we did was transform those numbers into objects where we could easily query, for example, last Tuesday, March 22nd, what was the second ball of the Mega Millions drawing, right? We can because we transform the data into objects that could be easily parsed and readable. And that helps us because we could provide a new way of checking numbers, right? We don't have to check the exact string. We can now check numbers, and there are certain games that have different combinations. Like you can win prizes if you have like the first two numbers right or the last two numbers right. So we're able to check that now. So that was one of the things we learned. Again, always hard to work with an old CMS. And as the site grew, and we kind of touched on this before. Another requirement that they have is that we have to save every log forever. I mean, I think it's 7 years, but it's basically forever. Of every person that enters the site, everything they do, every time content is posted, everything that is done on the site, we have to save a log for that. Now, if anybody here is a developer and has worked on a Drupal site, they know that database logging balloons, right? It just makes the database gigantic as it saves everything there, and it eventually starts making the site slower. So we had to come up with a system where we could every so often offload those logs to somewhere else, right, where they're safe and secure, and just kind of reset the actual database logs on the site. That way, if something happens, we can still check them and look for what happened, but they're not actively on the site. We quickly learned, the site. We initially built this on Pantheon. Pantheon was great for what we needed initially, but as the site grew and the requirements grew even more, we started hitting some walls, and we currently moved the site to Amazy. Amazy is one of the sponsors of Drupal of GovCon. They're great. They have a booth here. I recommend you guys check them out. And they're helping us basically, be able to have a little bit more power, a little bit dedicated IPs that are needed for vendors, and a couple of other things that we've seen that the site really needs in order to continue growing. So all of this are things that we learned along the way in this last year. Yes, and Neka, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Neka, you're right. Amazing use I can never pronounce that. Kubernetes to for scaling, yes, and for high availability. Um, so yes, it was quite a journey. Are there any questions regarding the site? Um, Neka, you had a great question. High availability. We worked with Pantheon to make sure the site was on their highest tier plan, and they work great. Like they were great. We do a lot of caching as well to make sure the site is available. When numbers drop, the site gets hit instantaneously by thousands of users at the same time that just want to see the numbers come in. So it was from a technology standpoint, it was really complicated because we have to cache a lot just to make sure, the site is available to everybody and quickly, but we can't cache too much or else, we're not going to get the latest updates. Again, the site gets updated every 5 minutes with new numbers. So it's a balancing game that we have to do where yes, we cache, but yes, we also provide the latest information. And yeah, it was quite a journey, but yeah, Pantheon helped us get there with the high availability. Again, we sometimes get hit with thousands of users at the same time. When we have events, we have hundreds of users on the site just looking at it at the same time. And now with Amazy, we'll be able to expand that even further. With other things. Cool. Any other questions, guys, regarding the site? I think we forgot to actually mention, what the actual site is. If you guys haven't seen it, feel free to go to it right now.
Yeah, and Brad, for your question, I know that Rolando would be able to answer that one, of course, a lot better. But yes, we do have some custom dashboards in the back end so that we are able to do queries of some of those different game numbers, even some of the contests as well.
Yes, and also to answer your question even further, Brad, a lot of it is just regular expressions. The problem is, we talk about a game. Let's say, Powerball, which is a very popular game. Turns out that Powerball right now has five numbers and a multiplier, but that might not have been the case, 20 years ago. Maybe 20 years ago, it wasn't like that. It had a different format, right? So how do you query the same game with different formatting? Right, and make sure the answers make sense, because now you're like, what are you asking? Are you just putting in four numbers or five numbers, right? So the answer was yes, a lot of complex code, a lot of regular expression to make sure the numbers match. And what really helped us was transforming the numbers from just plain old numbers stored as strings to an object where we can say, okay, number one, the first ball is this, the second ball is this, and then we can play around with that. Again, some of the games have a lot of combinations with them. It's not just the numbers. I one of the things we joke about. I didn't know a lot about lottery. I don't really play lottery myself, but I learned a lot about the rules creating the site, and now I can't play lottery because we built the site. We actually are barred from playing it, right? So we know the industry secrets or whatever. But there are games where it's not just picking the right numbers. There are combinations. There are maybe just the last numbers, or the first two numbers, or the first and the last numbers, and being able to query that and get results based off of that. It was definitely complex. Definitely, for sure.
Yeah, and Stephen, then to go on to your question, were we able to find those undocumented features before we began the project? And the answer is no, we didn't find them all before we began the project. Some of them came up along the way. And so we didn't have much of a say in shifting the timeline. So that was some of those times where us and the developers would pull pretty long nights just to make sure that we got everything fit in. We definitely did set some priorities. So we would go back and say for a few different things, what was requirements of going live and what are some of the things that we might be able to do, in the next few weeks or as a post launch. So some of those requests from the client, for example, the virtual events, that's something that we had been talking about before the launch, but we actually ended up doing post launch so that we were able to fit some of the other things that came up.
Exactly, yeah. And not only for this project, but as requirements change and come in, we see that clients, when they're in discovery, when they're in design, they want certain things, or they think certain things are important. But once they actually see the site being built, right, and they start clicking around, they're like, oh, maybe I wanted this other thing. So requirements are things that, as an agency or as anybody building a site, you kind of have to be flexible with, right? Flexible with, but at the same time, be realistic, right? Time is a thing. It's not unlimited. So if you're flexible enough to tell the client, hey, you now want this. All right, let's leave this other thing to a phase two, or maybe this gets done after launch, or we now discovered this, which happened a lot. Like I said, a bunch of things. We just happened to finally understand after a while, after digging in, after doing detective work. We were like, okay, now we understand how this works. Now we understand that this is going to take us X amount of time to do this. We would go back to Brittany, and Brittany would go back to the client and say, all right, let's talk about this, right? It's super important to have that communication and have the client involved in all of these decisions from very early on.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so this is, I don't know if anybody else has any other questions. It's a very important website for our agency. It's been very successful. The client is super happy. We've gotten great feedback. But one of the most important parts of the story that we wanted to take is sometimes you see, we wanted you to understand, I'm sorry, is that sometimes you see a great website, right? And you say, "Oh wow, they're amazing, and the site went well, and everything is well." Just because the end product it went great, that doesn't mean that the process was without issues, right? So if you're ever building a site and you're feeling frustrated that things aren't going well, and that things, they're popping, new requirements are popping up, and the client isn't sure, and the previous agency is not being helpful, or whatever, problems you might run into, understand that happens, and you kind of have to roll with the punches and make sure you have a good team, a great team, where you can kind of you rely on them and give them that feedback, and they can give them yours, and basically find a way to power through it, and hopefully the end result is great. But just because you see a great site, that doesn't mean that the process was just perfect. Like it doesn't happen like that when building sites. I think that's the main lesson I would take from DC Lottery. Brittany, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really good reminder just to mention about how like teamwork isn't that like fancy face that we use. Like it honestly is. Like obviously Rolando and I had to work really closely with each other for a period of a year, and so we became friends during that time. And a lot of the different developers and a lot of the different designers and UXers that joined us for this process, we really did all go in as a team and get it done. So that's a really good endpoint to end on.
Yes, and it definitely was a team effort. Everybody, the developers that did an amazing job, the designers, the UX people, and I have to mention Brittany because I have to, but no, actually, it's great as a developer. It's great having a good project manager that kind of wrangles the client and sets expectations. So teamwork is exactly the way to get to it, and we're very happy to have had this success. So thank you guys for coming to the sessions. To the session again, we'll be here for a couple more minutes if anybody else has any other questions. If not, enjoy the rest of Drupal GothCon. We'll see you guys around. Happy Wednesday.